our Global Peace Studies for Sustainable Development in Africa webinar. I would like to ask you to please mute your microphones if you are not speaking to us. Please mute your microphones, and I'll take this opportunity to welcome Cuthbert Mwendi, please. Thank you very much. Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're joining us. Welcome to Global Peace Studies for Sustainable Development in Africa. And today we are privileged and honored to have Professor Eli McCartyhy from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And he will be taking us through a very important topic, which is Just Peace Ethic Primer, Building Sustainable Peace and Breaking Cycles of Violence. Eli McCartyhy teaches at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. in theology, as well as Justice and Peace Studies. His most recent book is an edited volume called A Just Peace Ethic Primer, Breaking Cycles of Violence and Building Sustainable Peace. He also wrote Becoming Nonviolent Peacemakers, a virtue ethic for Catholic social teaching and US policy. He has also worked in administration from 2012 to 2020. He served as the Director of Justice and Peace for CMSM, which is the leadership conference of all the US Catholic men's religious orders. It's an honor and privilege to have you, Professor McCartyhy. You are now invited to share your screen, and I welcome everybody else to definitely pay attention to this wonderful presentation that is coming our way. Thank you very much indeed.
Great. Thank you so much, George. It's wonderful to be with everybody. Really excited to kind of walk with you and learn with you on these topics. So yeah, I've kind of been working on this for, I don't know, probably since around 2016 or so, and just kind of really excited to share some of the stories and the outcomes of this really a global conversation that's been happening. So this presentation is going to begin with two brief case studies to illustrate some of the key components of a Just Peace framework. And then I'll describe more systematically the basic components of the framework. And then finally, kind of describe the recent trajectory of Catholic and Christian discourse on just peace, as well as engage on a related discourse in the United Nations on sustaining peace. So this first case study is on the civil war that's been going on in South Sudan. And in the book, The Just Peace Ethic Primer, the authors John Ashworth and Mel Duncan reflect on the application of unarmed civilian protection as one tool among many in the rich field of active nonviolence. They concentrate on South Sudan and the Nonviolent Peace Force, which is an international non-governmental organization that protects civilians in violent conflicts and prevents violence through unarmed strategies, working side by side with local communities. So less than 3 years after independence, South Sudan experienced a civil war with ongoing violence between armed factions. Unarmed civilian protection is an emerging approach whereby trained civilian protection officers deploy field-tested interventions to provide direct protection to civilians in areas of violent conflict and work closely with local civil society to prevent further violence. So with 200 plus unarmed civilian protectors coming from 32 different countries and more than half coming from the local area, the mission of Nonviolent Peace Force in South Sudan represents the largest sustained application of unarmed protection in history. They focus on methods of relationship building, monitoring, rumor control, early warning, early response, capacity building and training, protective presence, accompaniment, and bodily interposition. An example in South Sudan was that local chiefs had made about 3 attempts to try to convene a dialogue, but each was falling short. So Nonviolent Peace Force learned that people involved in these dialogues, the chiefs, kind of feared traveling in each other's territory. Local government, the military, and Nonviolent Peace Force arranged for some peace talks, but then NP accompanied the chiefs and the local leaders to the talks. NP provided a protective presence as the rivals talked. The dialogue went remarkably well. They arranged for a freedom of movement between each other's villages. They reopened the hospital and schools. They urged their people to return home. And they set up a joint accountability structure. Such enabling of local infrastructure illuminates the just peace norm of conflict transformation, particularly the structural dimension. Altogether, NP was involved in 115 interventions to help arrange dialogue and monitor the agreement. The civilian protectors helped the leaders disseminate information about the ceasefire and document the peace agreement, including an agreed upon code of conduct for cattle movement and land use. At the request of the stakeholders, the team provided training in nonviolent conflict resolution and helped communities set up early warning, early response procedures. Such training and procedures illustrate the just peace norms of nonviolent education in cultivating peacemaking communities. One afternoon, a community of people alerted Nonviolent Peace Force that youth from different clans had converged at a cattle camp and were about to break into violence. An inter-ethnic group that included local villagers and internationals traveled to the camp. When they arrived, fighting had already broken out and some young men were wounded. NP's civilian protectors included Asha Asokan from India, who measures barely 5 feet tall, and Abraham Arok from the local area, who stands 6 feet 5 inches. As the peace team was shuttling back and forth between the contending clans, a younger fighter asked Abraham, "Who is this small girl?" "Asha Ashokan," responded Abraham. "Where does she come from?" "India." The youth told his colleagues to stop fighting. The youth backed off from each other. The young leader exclaimed, quote, "This problem has become so serious that people from other countries are coming. I will stop now." A local nurse later explained to the authors that according to our culture, we don't want to do something bad in front of outsiders. So the team got a promise from both sides that they would not fight and they would wait for the chiefs to come and talk. The next morning, the chiefs arrived and mediated a deal. At their request, NP monitored the process. 5 years later, those two clans have not resumed fighting each other. In December 2013, the power struggle between leaders and factions reignited a vicious civil war. Men began killing civilians based on their ethnic identity. Violence spread quickly to many parts of the country. Nonviolent Peace Force civilian protection officers Derek Oakley and Andres Andres Gutierrez were working in the Boer protection of civilians area when a militia reached the berm and started shooting people point blank. Chaos broke out. Derek and Andreas ran to a hut with 14 women and children, and the protection officers stood in the doorway. On 3 different occasions, the young militia pointed guns in their faces and profanely screamed that they had to leave. The young fighters wanted the women and children. Each time, Derek and Andreas held up their Nonviolent Peace Force identity badges and calmly said, "We are unarmed. We are here to protect civilians, and we will not leave." After the 3rd time, the militia finally left and could be heard telling the other fighters to stay away from the hut. Church personnel in towns such as Juba and Malakal were also able to give limited protection to the civilians sheltering in their church compounds. 56 other civilians were killed in 20 minutes as the UN peacekeepers remained in their quarters consulting with their military superiors in New Delhi as to what they should do. Later, Andreas reflected, "If we had had a gun in those instances like an armed peacekeeper, we probably would have been killed." Indeed, 2 UN armed peacekeepers were killed trying to defend civilians at a UN camp in another town, Akobo. Women living in Bentu and the other POC protection of civilian areas have to go to the bush to collect firewood, where soldiers often sexually assault or even rape them. Rape is a weapon of war. Sometimes women have strategically sent older women on these treks because they're less likely to be raped. During a 2-year period when NP civilian protectors accompanied them, there was only 1 incident of an attack, and that happened to an MP protector who was thrown to the ground by an inebriated soldier. Her teammates intervened and the soldier left. Nonviolent Peace Forces train more than 1,900 local women who have formed 44 women's protection teams. Through their activism, the women increase their own self-protection, take care of younger girls to make sure they know where to go and how to keep themselves safe. And this illustrates the just peace norm of cultivating peacemaking institutions. Unarmed civilian protection entails cultivating and manifesting the just peace virtues of empathy, solidarity, hospitality, courage, and justice. And research on the impact of unarmed protection has demonstrated that lives can be saved, communities are able to stay at home rather than be displaced, peace and human rights work is more possible and involves more people in a wider area, living and working in affected communities supports the reestablishment of relationships and communication across divided communities. Attitudes and behavior of armed actors have been impacted. So the second case, this is more ethnic violence in Kenya. In the Just Peace Ethic Primer book, Teresa Wamuyu Wachira writes about finding the nexus between just peace approaches and African indigenous approaches to violent conflicts, especially in the cases in the Kenya North Rift region. She contextualizes the North Rift region conflicts in the countries indicated. Then she highlights the role that the current African indigenous approaches are playing in promoting a just and peaceful society. And then she discusses the issue of how the conflicts in the North Rift region can be transformed by incorporating the positive aspects of the African indigenous approaches and a just peace approach. In one of the violent incidents in 1992, Bishop Courier, following in Jesus's way of active nonviolence, decided to go and check on the safety of the religious sisters who lived and worked in one of the violence-prone areas in his diocese. As he drove, every vehicle he passed along the way flashed lights as a warning not to proceed with the journey because of the magnitude of the violence. Fearing for the safety of the religious sisters, Bishop Courier ignored the warning and drove right into a riotous group of armed youth who were forcibly evicting people and threatening to burn down the town. He stood between the hundreds of youth who were armed with bows and arrows against about 10 overwhelmed police officers who had now sought his assistance. As the youth surged forward, the police started shouting, which forced the bishop to raise his hands over his head and shout, "Don't shoot, don't shoot." After a tense standoff between the youth and the police, the youth retreated. However, they requested that Bishop Courier escort them away from the police for fear the police would shoot them in the back as they left. He modeled the just peace practice of unarmed civilian protection. Another story Teresa shares is how each community involved selected representatives who met and ironed out their grievances. Other activities in which they engaged were rebuilding houses that were destroyed, building common markets and water points in neutral places. In addition, the communities engaged in common activities such as sharing meals and participating in sports. In addition, such initiatives actualized the just peace norm of cultivating peacemaking communities and institutions. She also explains how a group of women from the North Rift region chose to group together to promote cohesion and to create a peaceful society. They started by cooking together and constructing mud houses for other women whose houses had been destroyed. As they interacted, they prayed and shared their stories of pain, thus breaking the communication barriers. These actualize the just peace norms of sustaining spiritual practices and the virtue of empathy. One woman shares that as they engaged in their daily routine of knitting, they would discuss ways of averting the violence in the future. Teresa reflects on how every Pokot woman has a lakeshio, a birth belt that she wears for support when she is pregnant. In some instances, when a mother is not in support of any male members of the family taking part in the conflicts of war, she will refuse to wear the belt. Also, a woman can decide to remove her belt at the peak of a fight or war and lay it down between the people who are fighting. The tradition of using this birth belt to stop or prevent conflicts or wars is practiced among all of the Kalenjin sub-tribes. This practice also resembles the tactic of identifying and mobilizing credible messengers in the community to interrupt violence, which is often found within groups that use the just peace practice of unarmed protection. In the African worldview of Ubuntu, the people thrive individually and collectively by living together in harmony, making the following biblical aspiration a reality. Quote, "How delightful it is to live as sisters and brothers together," unquote. In essence, therefore, incorporating the Ubuntu approach would promote an African perspective to a just peace approach. She suggests 3 cultural dimensions that could be incorporated as a foundation of a virtue-based approach to a just peace ethic. These dimensions particularly help to illuminate the just peace norm of cultivating peacemaking cultures. They are worldviews, experiences, and attitudes of affected communities. In addition, the communities can engage women more at all levels of decision-making and practices of peacemaking and justice-making. This would actualize the just peace norm of participatory processes. Learning institutions within the North Rift region, where these counties are situated, can be encouraged, according to Teresa, to create and utilize peace corners in or outside of the classroom, and peace clubs and peace cafes. She says this would actualize the just peace norm of education in nonviolence. Religious leaders in Kenya, and specifically in the North Rift region countries, have access to nonviolent teachings, moral authority, and permanence. Thus, they have opportunities to act as bridges between the government and the citizens spread out in different counties in Kenya. Such bridging initiatives actualize the just peace norm of relationality. So those are two cases that sort of illustrate some of these practices and some of the norms of a just peace approach. And in the book, the authors worked with some of these norms and refined it based on the cases, and we ended up with something new and different at the end of the book. So here's kind of a systemic description of this just peace framework, and I'd be happy to kind of email out a version of this afterwards that George can share. So the just peace ethical framework or process has arisen from and within an approach that listens to the experiences and voices of people in conflict situations across various cultural spaces. This orientation envisions a just peace as a way of cooperation for the common good of all, consistent with human dignity. Care for our ecological home, the prevention of violence, and a focus on the transformation of conflict through nonviolent strategies. These just peace norms operate in three distinct spheres or categories that may overlap in time and space. They apply to all stages of conflict. Strategies and actions chosen must enhance or at least not obstruct the following norms, as well as keep means and ends consistent. Such just peace strategies and actions are always contextual, with attention to those most impacted by a situation. Sustaining spiritual disciplines are critical to the fruitful exercise of these norms. So there's three basic categories: virtues and skills to transform conflict, breaking cycles of violence, and building more sustainable peace. So for the first category, some of the norms include virtuous habits, such as mercy, hospitality, courage, justice, compassion. Education and training in key skills, such as nonviolent communication, analysis of root causes, intersectional analysis, and needs-based analysis. Participatory processes. And fourth, forming nonviolent peacemaking communities, institutions, and cultures. The second category, breaking dynamics or cycles of violence, includes the following norms: reflexivity, trying as best we can to keep the means or the methods consistent with the ends we claim to seek, consistent and congruent. Second, rehumanization, through the language, the images or labels, the narratives we use to describe the other or the adversary, including ourselves. Third, conflict transformation of the conflict by trying to address root causes through consistent dialogue, trust-building initiatives, trauma reduction, meeting the needs of all. The next three norms in this category are acknowledging responsibility for harm. This can be done through public statements or more formal restorative justice mechanisms or processes. Nonviolent direct action. This includes the unarmed civilian protection, like in South Sudan, or civil resistance or strategic nonviolent resistance, as well as nonviolent civilian-based defense. And lastly, integral disarmament. This is about creating the conditions and that can actualize the reduction of armed weapons, along with the reduction of bitterness and hostility and hatred that sometimes lurks within persons and communities. a kind of integral process. And then the final category, building sustainable peace. So relationality and reconciliation, promoting this across all sectors of society, relations from different spheres and different communities, such as interreligious dialogue and cooperation, or even truth and reconciliation commissions. A robust civil society and just governance, the redistribution of political power, ecological sustainability and justice. Number 4, human dignity and human rights, including the adversaries by ensuring their human rights, cultivating empathy for all actors. Economic, gender, and racial justice with a focus on the marginalized and the most vulnerable. So the 2020 Just Peace Ethic Primer book provides a set of international cases as well as cases from the US that work with and refine this just peace ethic. And they include cases like we discussed, civil war in South Sudan, ethnic violence in Kenya, also gang violence in El Salvador, gender violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo, ISIS in Iraq, women-led movements in the Philippines, including US cases around immigration, environmental racism, and the death penalty. Now, compared to just war reasoning, a just peace ethic seems to better form us as peacemakers by enabling us to imagine, develop, and stay committed to nonviolent practices. It also better enables us to transform conflict, get to the root causes, and build a sustainable peace. It is consistent with human dignity and ecological care, whereas any war significantly distorts and damages both. For instance, war generates trauma and often moral injury. It lowers empathy and a sense of gift of all persons. A just peace approach is less likely to lead to the structural and cultural violence such as propaganda and the dehumanization of others, that is generated in the process of being prepared for war, as well as a corresponding arms race. Whereas both divert needed resources, both structural violence and cultural violence, divert needed resources and often exacerbate mistrust. A just peace approach also helps us better stay out of and break cycles of violence, which even wars that appear just still get us stuck in these cycles. For example, World War II led to the Cold War and numerous proxy wars such as Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan in the 80s, which led to the conditions and dynamics for 9/11 in the US and 20 more years of war in Afghanistan. In turn, the just peace ethic is more likely to actually prevent, limit, and diffuse an ongoing war. The just peace ethic will also better enable us to move closer toward outlawing war, a goal that some leaders, including the Catholic Church at Vatican II in the early 1960s, called all people to strain every muscle to the outlawing of war. So the last two sections here, Catholic and Christian discourses on just peace. The way of Jesus has been increasingly reappropriated in contemporary theology toward a way of just peace. For example, in the Catholic Church, most of the earlier documents of Catholic social teaching from Rerum Novarum in 1891 through Pacem in Terris in 1963 primarily drew on a natural law framework and used a deontological model of moral theology. However, at Vatican II, there was a noticeable shift to draw more readily on the scriptures, especially the Christian scriptures, with its clearer resonance for virtue ethics and to extend the call of holiness to all persons, not merely clergy or religious orders. This has contributed to positions in Catholic social teaching and thought that have increasingly integrated the concepts of justice and peace. Thus, the Catholic imagination is opening up to visions of the church as a, quote, peaceable and nonviolent community for some, which also increasingly values the realistic potential of peace building, reconciliation, or nonviolent peacemaking practices for public policy. This trend has continued through Pope Paul IV, Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, and now in a more pronounced way with Pope Francis. Notably, in the context of Vatican II's ecumenical opening in the Catholic Church, the turning to elements of just peace in official Catholic Church teaching has also been coupled with some similar turnings to just peace by other Christian church organizations. For example, the United Church of Christ formally declared itself a just peace church in 1985, and numerous congregations followed, declaring themselves just peace congregations. Glenn Stassen coordinated with a broad range of Christian theologians to develop a, quote, just peacemaking theory, which consists of a set of normative practices arising into view by both tracking effective practices and using the analogical imagination with the scriptural witness. Stassen wanted to address the question of what practices have worked to prevent war. Interfaith approaches to just peacemaking, along with other just peace approaches, have also developed. Further, in 2011, the World Council of Churches produced a document titled Ecumenical Call to Just Peace. They defined just peace as a, quote, collective and dynamic, yet grounded process of freeing human beings from fear and want, of overcoming enmity, discrimination, and oppression, and of establishing conditions for just relationships that privilege the experience of the most vulnerable and respect the integrity of creation, unquote. In 2012, the United Methodist Church recognized that war is incompatible with the teachings and example of Christ, and thus rejected war as an instrument of national foreign policy. In November 2013, the World Council of Churches adopted the, quote, Way of Just Peace as part of its 10th assembly. In 2016, 2019, and 2022, global conferences on nonviolence and just peace were organized in Rome by Pax Christi International, along with agencies and actors in the Vatican. These included many voices from violent conflict zones around the world. For example, some of these voices were from Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, Colombia, El Salvador, Mexico, South Sudan, Congo, Nigeria, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines. Key contributors in these consultations were Black women and women of color, such as Teresia Wachira, Kanini Kemu from Kenya, Sister Nazik Mahdi from Iraq, Yasmin Nario Galase from the Philippines, Sister Lillian from Nigeria, and Shawnee Daniels Sykes from the US. In between these three global conferences, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative organized many regional gatherings, events at the UN, universities, encounters with local grassroots organizers. A prominent moment and outcome has been Pope Francis's Nonviolence, a Style of Politics for Peace message in 2017 as part of the World Day of Peace Messages. At the 2019 conference with the Vatican's Dicastery of Integral Human Development, the outcome document called for a robust description of nonviolence and the just peace norms to be added to the catechism. In 2020, Pope Francis' encyclical Fratelli Tutti points to the first just peace category of engaging conflict constructively when he proposes, quote, processes of encounter that build a people that can accept differences, unquote. He has also called us to, quote, become nonviolent people and to build nonviolent communities that care for our common home, unquote. Pope Francis points to the second just peace category of breaking cycles of violence in Fratelli Tutti when he says, quote, "Every act of violence committed against a human being is a wound. Every violent death diminishes us as people. Violence leads to more violence. We must break this cycle which seems inescapable," unquote. So the conversation and exploration of just peace continues in Christian communities as well as beyond such communities. So last section, civil society and UN discourse, sustaining peace agenda. In the early 2000s, civil society organizations were finally making significant progress on persuading government leaders that wars and violent interventions, whether deemed just or not, were regularly generating cycles of violence and trauma. In 2005, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan recognized a gaping hole in the UN which lacked any systematic way to help countries transition from war to a sustaining peace. In turn, the UN peacebuilding architecture was created. As part of the 10-year review in 2015, an advisory group of experts presented a report where they argued that sustaining peace must flow through all the organs of the UN and orient activity before, during, and after violent conflicts. In 2016, the UN General Assembly and Security Council adopted the review, accepting this integrated approach and described sustaining peace as a goal and a process to build a common vision of society, ensuring needs are taken into account, addressing root causes, preventing violence, and cultivating reconciliation. In 2017, the International Peace Institute, which works closely with the UN, produced a document explaining sustaining peace. They emphasize that it is not primarily about conflict, but rather focuses on building peace where it already exists, i.e., on what is already working. In praxis, they argue that sustaining peace is a meta-policy, which must be positioned above other sectors so as to build on and account for economic, social, and security policies. They say all policies must be infused with the intention to sustain peace. They give examples of this in Costa Rica's governmental organ called the Ministry of Justice and Peace, Ghana's National Peace Council, Kenya's National Peace Council, and Ethiopia's Ministry for Peace. In 2018, the International Peace Institute launched a series of roundtable discussions and a research project on how prevention and sustaining peace had been operationalized in countries. For example, in the case of study of Papua New Guinea, they identified challenges of self-determination efforts from Bougainville, intercommunal violence, sexual violence, climate change, and poor development. Yet, they found existing UN efforts to build the capacity of government and civil society, facilitate dialogue, assist in weapons disposal, provide peace education, training in human rights law, and cultivate reconciliation. However, important gaps and critical challenges linger in this case and for the sustaining peace agenda more broadly. Regarding this case analysis in Papua New Guinea, it may benefit from more attention to cultivating key virtues such as empathy, compassion, humility, solidarity, nonviolence. Also, it may benefit from more attention to training in key nonviolent skills such as nonviolent communication and nonviolent resistance. These virtues and skills are central to engaging conflict constructively. Further, there seems to be room for more explicit reference or commitment to rehumanization of adversaries in changing the language, narrative, and relationships. There is also potential benefit in attention to nonviolent direct action, such as unarmed protection. These practices are central to breaking cycles of violence. Key challenges and opportunities also arise for a sustaining peace agenda understood and implemented as a meta policy. For example, without an adequate ethical framework, the meta policy may more likely be neglected and lack commitment. Likewise, the policy may also more readily be abused, as representatives of the International Peace Institute have acknowledged. Another challenge without such an ethical framework is the risk of limiting the imagination about the range of possible nonviolent practices or strategies. The Just Peace ethical framework or process described earlier is one critical way to address these gaps and support such a sustaining peace agenda. So I began this presentation with 2 case studies to illustrate some of the key components of a Just Peace framework. Then I described more systematically the basic components of a Just Peace framework, and then finally described the recent trajectory of Catholic and Christian discourse on Just Peace. I also engaged a related discourse at the UN in sustaining peace with some initial considerations on how a Just Peace ethical framework can address key gaps and support such an agenda. So thank you for your time. Peace be with you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Eli McCartyhy, for this wonderful presentation. And it's now time for questions and answers and comments. You may just raise your hand and ask a question directly, or just put it in chat. And you are all welcome actually to turn on your video so we can see you, if you don't mind, and if your connection is good enough. And so, Professor McCartyhy, okay, I can see there is a hand from Afiz Sofiano. Would you like to begin?
Thank you, sir. I really appreciate the wonderful presentation and how the presentation goes, because from the analysis of the cases that we have at hand and coupled with what Donna provided us, that there is ongoing war in Kenya right now, I think the intervention of this Just Peace norms or ethics is very, very needed now. So my question is that I need a clarity on Just Peace norm or ethics, because I can see from the presentation that we have Just Peace norm as well as Just Peace ethics. Which one is more appropriate? Because I know that norms is a subset of ethics. So why ethics is more universal than norms? I don't know which one do you think is going to be more appropriate to put in there. Then on the case of the Sudan, are we knowing the fact that the date of the election has been announced to be December 2024, while the transition will take place 2025 February? How do you think that the Just Peace norms will be applicable to restore political institutions in South Sudan? That's my number 2 question. Then number 3, how do you think that the war that is ongoing in Kenya right now, that we can apply the Just Peace norms? Then number 4, what is the effort of the Catholic and the Church in their peace dialogue or discourses? How can we apply this to the ongoing war in Ukraine and Russia, based on the fact that by Friday they will be celebrating 1 year of the war? So these are my 4 questions. Thank you.
Would you like to respond to those, Eli?
Yeah, thank you so much for those really good questions. There's a lot there to unpack. So I'll just say a few things, and I think folks in the group probably have a lot of good insights too particularly about what's going on in South Sudan now and Kenya, for example. Just on the question about ethics and norms, I think the language of ethics, is sort of the broader framework. So it's an ethical framework, and within that framework, you have a set of norms that can offer guidance for strategies or actions. That's kind of been the way it's been described, but if there are better ways to kind of describe it, certainly kind of open to that. On South Sudan and Kenya, I'd really like to kind of maybe open that up to folks in the group to see if you have ideas on how the Just Peace norms could be helpful today. I mean, just in general, with elections coming up in South Sudan, I think the norm around training in key nonviolent skills so that people can be trained, not just like in kind of nonviolent communication for how to deal with interpersonal conflict, but other skills like bystander intervention and unarmed protection so they can actually be deployed at key locations around the election period to help diffuse or prevent violence that might occur. And then certainly, after that, you need the ongoing work of participatory processes, right, including women and key stakeholders and youth leaders in order to develop plans that would be more consistent with a kind of sustainable peace and political processes that would be inclusive. But yeah, definitely just want to open that up to others if others have comments on South Sudan or Kenya. Regarding Ukraine, I actually went to Ukraine twice last year, and I've written about 5 articles about it. I've been trying to do a lot of advocacy on it here, particularly in the U.S. One trip was an interfaith delegation, about 17 people back in May, and then another trip in August was meeting some of the local peace builders and nonviolent organizers in Ukraine. There's there's been many nonviolent actions in Ukraine, but there's a group in the occupied territories that have been using pretty courageous non-cooperation from, teachers refusing to teach the Russian curriculum, farmers refusing to sell grain to Russian soldiers, fire departments refusing to join the Russian infrastructure. There are other stories of people blocking tanks and fraternizing with Russian soldiers and so forth. There's a huge report that came out about the impact of this that I can share. So, I think there's a lot that Just Peace can contribute to this particular case. Just a couple things. One is like really being attentive to some of the root causes of the conflict, right? We know that this war didn't begin in 2022. It began back in 2014, 2015. It's been an ongoing escalation. And it's been that strategy of increased militarization, which has got us to even more and more kind of war. And of course, Russia is completely wrong for invading. But the complexity of these root causes is more than just kind of black and white or good versus evil or, democracy versus authoritarianism. We also know that they almost had an agreement in March, and they were pretty close. And then the Ukrainian media actually reported that Boris Johnson from the UK came to Ukraine and told Zelensky that, he doesn't need to sign an agreement. We can win this war. Even if you want to make an agreement, we're not ready to have an agreement. So essentially that cut off diplomacy at that point. And they've had other agreements like on prisoner swaps and, the grain flowing from the south and evacuation routes, but they haven't got back really to the table to discuss how to end the war. So some of those root causes are really critical to note. And then the last thing I'll say about it for now, I'm happy to send some articles I've written, but I think when groups or countries are in really difficult situations like Ukraine is when they're being invaded, a just peace approach is not about like judging or condemning them or any similar group for deciding to lean primarily to violent resistance. But at the same time, I think a just peace approach is not about justifying that violent resistance. It's more about how do we accompany groups or countries in this case, how do we accompany them in deep solidarity and focus on ways to break the cycle of violence, for the sake of a more kind of sustainable peace. And that's difficult, but it's possible. So those are some initial thoughts. Happy to send some other articles and talk more about it later, perhaps.
Thank you so much indeed. As we hear from Thomas Duffin, I think I would like to also get somebody from Kenya and speak to us about the situation there, because talking about war is worrying a lot. So what's the situation on the ground? Maybe Donna Pido, you could tell us what is happening, or Lillian, or I've seen also a couple of others from Kenya. But as you prepare, please, can we go to Thomas Duffin, please?
Right, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my video camera doesn't seem to be working, so I'll just speak. I just want to thank Professor McCarthy. Brilliant overview. Thank you so much. I want to pose a problem that I don't think was addressed, which I think is really, really important, particularly in the Ukraine situation, which I'm speaking from France. We're totally concerned about this. Which is the question of truth. I didn't hear the word truth as a virtue, and yet to me it's the absolute foundation of virtue ethics. And what we've got in wars nowadays is the weaponization of information, through the internet, propaganda. UNESCO says war begins in the minds of men. Well, it's going everywhere. It's going off, even within countries. Like within the USA, it's completely a polarized society. Now, this has been deliberately targeted by Putin with his KGB mindset. We didn't expect this. I think I belong to what we could call the naive generation of peace thinkers. We thought people had a natural, gravitation towards light, truth, love, and peace. What do you do when people come along that seem to have a completely inverse gravitation towards lies, violence, power, and hate? And how can we rethink? I think the non-violent strategy of a just peace has to be rethought for our information, because it's now possible through the internet, and I'm talking about groups like Cambridge Analytica, who are past masters of misinformation. You can create a war in any country within a couple of weeks through misinformation, and that's what's going on. How do we stop that using this just peace approach? And my final point is sort of metaphysical or philosophical point. I think the problem is that the concept of truth has been relativized intellectually. We now have, well, there's Putin's truth, there's Ukraine's truth, there's the EU's truth. We don't know who's right, so let's not take a stand. Truth has become like optional. And in countries like Kenya and many African countries, well, there's the Muslims' truth, there's the Christians' truth in Nigeria, so we're not going to take a stand. I think we need to do some deep thinking and we need an theology, which is the scientific study of truth, we need to rethink this. And I don't know how we're going to do it. We have a Jane on this call, maybe Mahavira's insight that absolute truth is multifaceted, and therefore the only response should be non-violence. Maybe we need to look, broader. Anyway, thank you so much, Mr. McCarthy. Brilliant talk, and I'd love your, email for further sharings.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Really, really good points. Yes, such a critical aspect is truth and the search for truth and the commitment to shift our perspectives when it's not in accord with the reality or the truth. So, yeah, I think you're right. I agree with what you're saying. I think from the Just Peace framework, yeah, certainly the virtue of honesty, I think might be something that, corresponds with that to some extent. I think the other piece is in the category on breaking cycles of violence, there's this norm called rehumanization. And this is really about the the way in which we tell the story about what's happening, right? The narratives we choose to explain or describe what seems to be going on. Are those narratives contributing to a process of rehumanizing the stakeholders, or do those narratives contribute to increased dehumanization? These people are evil, these people are monsters, these people don't listen to anything but military force. Like, those are all certain narratives that, even if there are aspects of truth there, they can contribute to dehumanization, which makes it more likely that violence is going to either occur or kind of continue. So yeah, I like what you were kind of thinking about, the multifaceted aspects of truth. It kind of reminded me of, Gandhi's contribution on this was that we all sort of have pieces of the truth, right? And if we really want to lean into the truth, then we need to create processes and spaces where we can draw those pieces out of each person or community. And if we're destroying certain groups or leaning into violence, then we're obstructing our ability to really lean into what the broader truth of reality might be. So he had a really close connection between nonviolence and truth, right? Satyagraha was kind of the overall theme, and that meant grasping truth. So yeah, I think that's a critical piece that definitely deserves more attention and development.
Thank you so much. Yeah, okay, thumbs up to you from Thomas and Egon. And so somebody from Kenya, please, if you could tell us about the situation on the ground. Father Elisei Rutagambwa or Donna Pido, Lillian. Maybe you can do it later. I don't seem to see a question in chat.
George, can you see the hand of Stella Shulika?
Yes, I can see she's clapping. Stella, would you like to say something? Right. Thank you, Stella.
Greetings, everyone. I'm just clapping to say that's such an insightful presentation. And on my part, I think I would like to get to know more and learn more or research more about sustainable or sustaining peace. So that's what I'm really interested in. But apart from that, it was a fantastic presentation.
Thank you so much, Stella.
Thank you, Stella. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of amazing research that's coming out about this. I mean, the one piece that I find really inspiring is the 2011 book called Why Civilian Resistance Works. And, they were looking at nonviolent resistance compared to violent resistance campaigns over like 1900 through 2006. Not only did they find that nonviolent resistance was twice as effective in the short term, like political objectives, but what I think is more important is they found that nonviolent resistance approaches was at least 10 times more likely to lead to a more durable peace or sustainable peace, right? So even when there were violent resistance movements that seemed to succeed, almost inevitably, it led to either another civil war in the next 5 years, military coups, massive corruption, all sorts of kind of harmful patterns of violence. But yeah, I think there's a lot of really important research that needs to be done on that, because that's one of the big claims, whether it's Ukraine or some other war, is like, well, the only way we're going to get to durable peace is if we win this war, right? Or if we militarize this particular region. So the underlying claim is, what is it that really leads to sustainable peace and durable peace? And I think the more we can kind of unpack that, hopefully the better off we'll be.
Thank you so much. And Joe, you have a question or comment, please go ahead. Joe, please.
Thank you very much.
All right, you're welcome.
Okay. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. Sorry, I joined late, but I love the concept of rehumanization. I feel like that's an area that can be weaponized for the good. When you said war causes trauma, I realized that before war, there's something that's kind of like trauma that's before the war that happens. And that's the polarization. And I realized that a lot of media that we consume, music, movies, a lot of that is actually very polarizing to the general population at large, and it's a polarization that happens unaware. It happens unnoticed. Kind of like, for example, a movie like I don't know, like. So anyway, my thoughts on that was to weaponize media for peace, as in like actually making the truth available and consumable in such quantities as we consume media for entertainment. Because I'm realizing, as much as we do in academia, there's very few minds on earth that are really focused here. And most people are trapped in it. It's like entertainment with education and throw a lot of truth in it. Sorry, I spoke for so long.
Yeah, those are really amazing points and really important insights. Thank you for sharing that. It is so critical. I mean, this is a major challenge in my context in the US for sure. I don't know if you've heard of an organization called Search for Common Ground. I know they're a group that have a number of projects in Africa and other places, but one of the main things they do is this media work, and not only bringing in young adults, but others to try to tell stories and to illuminate ways of leaning into peace and justice through radio, through television, a number of different types of media. But yeah, it's a really critical piece that definitely needs to be addressed. And I think relating that to the Just Peace framework, right? This kind of idea or this norm, this practice of forming more nonviolent communities and cultures, like really a key part of that is the media work and addressing these patterns of polarization that you're wisely bringing up.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will ask one question. Once again, thank you for this wonderful presentation, Eli. We're talking about the development really of peacemaking, peace building in the Catholic Church. You've mentioned what I would term as the pillars of peace building, and one of them being the Catholic social teaching, which definitely is based on the scriptures, and of course on the teachers of the church, etc. And the second one, ecumenical and interfaith, initiative and programs. And the third one is Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. And the fourth one, you mentioned Pope Francis. And I was wondering whether Pope Francis stands out really from the rest of the popes in terms of, commitment to peace, peace research, peace building, peace education, or whether he's, you just mentioned him because he's current, because I know he has written about peace and fratelli tutti, sustainability, etc. Would you like to shed some light on Pope Francis and peace building?
Yeah, thank you, George, for that question. I would say in general, I think Pope Francis stands out compared to the other more recent popes. There has certainly been a pretty consistent trajectory since Vatican II and Pacem in Terris in the 1960s to really start to lean more into peace building, the connection between justice and peace, and so forth. And certainly the general challenging or refrain of, no war ever again, never war. Like popes have been saying that at least since the 1960s. Even I think it was Pope Benedict during World War I who said we shouldn't really even have a just war theory. Like this is, we need to move on. So there's been a definite trajectory, and Francis is moving, kind of working in that increasing opening to, I would say, peace building and nonviolence and just peace. Some of the unique contributions, for sure, I think one is his praxis, right? The way in which he lives his life beyond the teachings and the statements, right? It's the visiting of the refugees and the migrants. It's the housing of the unhoused in Rome. It's his going to South Sudan and kissing the feet of one of the leaders involved in the violent conflict. It's this like pattern of gestures and like the practical and the concrete that I think really kind of stands out and invites us into a broader imagination about not only what being a Christian looks like, but what nonviolent peacemaking can be about. And of course, his World Day of Peace message, Nonviolence, Style of Politics for Peace in 2017 was the first kind of high-level document really focused on nonviolence as a theme. And it unpacked the interfaith aspects. Abdul Ghaffar Khan was mentioned, the Muslim leader, Gandhi, Lama Bowie from Liberia, and so forth. So yeah, I think he's making some really important contributions. He's definitely increasingly questioned the tradition of just war and really has put that in the space of discussion for its legitimacy. And I think when I was talking about Ukraine, this theme of accompaniment is really something that I've noticed in him, right? That he's trying to be pastoral in his approaches to these difficult issues and leaning into what does accompaniment look like? Not only trying to speak the truth about a situation, not only providing resources like ambulances to Ukraine, but being present, physically present when one is able to kind of to enter into some of that risk to some extent, but also for the purpose of broadening out, how might we break this cycle of violence? How might we break this cycle of violence? Which is a very different focus than, how do we win this war, for example. So I think those are some pivotal contributions, and hopefully he can hang in a few more years and continue to do that. But we are certainly hoping he will perhaps write an encyclical on nonviolence. But we'll see. He's done a lot.
Thank you so much indeed, Eli. And now we'll go to Lester and then Egon. Can we start with you, Lester, please? And then we'll go to Egon.
Oh, this has been a great presentation and conversation. I had to go to Tanzania to talk with Eli, who's just down the street from me here. The wonders of modern technology. So I'm really I just love your efforts to sort of systematize this idea of just peace, and wanted to drill down a little bit, if you could, on some of the background, the Gandhian background on it, and the incident that you were sort of the group that you were talking about in Kenya reminded me a lot of Gandhi's Shanti Sena, the concept of a peace force, and I was really struck by his idea of having a peace forces at every layer of society, starting at the village, where and it sounded like this is the group that you were talking about in Kenya, where they were building peace in the community, getting to know. Gandhi talked about having this Shanti Sena in the village, where people build trust across the divides, the social divides within the community, and I'm just wondering if you're familiar with Gandhi's ideas, if there are similarities and differences between the sorts of things you're talking about. Although I think you've done a good job of trying to systematize a broad range of things that have emerged since Gandhi. I mean, we've gotten much more sophisticated, even though he was the inspiration for a lot of it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Lester. It's good to see you again. Appreciate all your contributions. Gandhi's Shanti Sena. Most definitely, this is, I think, what Nonviolent Peace Force really developed out of that vision. So Nonviolent Peace Force is the largest organization that does unarmed protection. I think they started in the late 80s or 90s. It's this idea, this kind of vision that trained professional unarmed civilian protection units, or sometimes called community safety units, like we have here in DC, can contribute to not only building trust in the community, but de-escalating conflicts, preventing violence in ways that are less likely to not only induce harm, but are more likely to generate a more sustainable kind of just peace. So Gandhi's vision was these Shanti Sena groups would primarily initially kind of help with the Muslim-Hindu conflicts and riots that were happening in India as they were kind of moving towards independence. So him and Abdul Ghaffar Khan, one of the major Muslim nonviolent leaders, created the first nonviolent peace army that we kind of know of. Like, I think it had up to 100,000 people at one point, and they were resisting the British occupation. So that's a book called The Nonviolent Soldier of Islam, I think is the title. Him and Gandhi they were developing these Shanti Sena, or these local kind of peace teams, if you will, to kind of work in the neighborhoods and the villages and so forth. And so like in the US and Canada, we have a network called the Shanti Sena Network. And it's basically a network of organizations that do unarmed protection. So it includes, in DC, we have the DC Peace Team, the Meta Peace Team is in Michigan, the Portland Peace Team is in California, Nonviolent Peace Force has an office in Minnesota, they're also in Belgium. Cure Violence is a really growing expression of this. They focus on preventing shootings and homicides, and they hire credible messengers, and they use a public health approach. That is, violence kind of moves like a disease, right? It expands based on exposure and clustering, and you have to interrupt the transmission and so forth. So, there's a lot of great examples. I know in the US, we've had a lot of challenges with armed policing, and there are a lot of communities trying to experiment with community safety units, unarmed protection units to deal with some of those challenges. But I think it's most definitely connected and worth exploring and scaling up. The Nonviolent Peace Force is actually in Ukraine as well. They're in Mykolaiv and Kherson and Kharkiv, and they're accompanying elderly, disabled, and children to get them to safety and so forth.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. Can we go to Egon, please?
Like Lester, I'm also in the public, and so So perhaps you will hear some voices in the background. Eli, thank you very much for your lecture and your speech. I like your university, Georgetown University. Very often I stayed there. So let me return to one term you mentioned from the Pope, style. Actually, nonviolence as a style of new politics is for me is too less. Actually, I don't know exactly what he's meaning by using this word. I look for a translation. Perhaps it's wrong by translation, but really he used this word. It's too less for me. But this is only a remark. I would like to return to Ukraine. The German Church, Catholic Church, you cannot find a position in the position of German Church. You cannot find any mention of Jesus, of Sermon of Mount, of loving enemies. You cannot find. You can find Kant, Immanuel Kant, and so on. But we have two declarations without any recursion to this biblical ethics. I'm so frustrated by this. So, but a third remark. Very often we are confronted by the reproach that we have no resolution for the conflict. But I think I think I have a solution. But I'm sure that Putin, Russia, and all parts of the affairs will not hear it. But my solution is a double federalism, a cultural federalism by Russia, and an administrative and a political federalism of the sovereign Ukraine. I hope you can understand my solution. Though the Russian is allowed to go over the border in a cultural way, not in a political and administrative way, and the Ukraine is guaranteed an administrative and political federalism in their own sovereign country. This would be my offer to Putin. Yeah, he is interested in a cultural link to the people, to the Russian people in Ukraine. That's okay, no problem. Yeah, and I think there should be also a balance between the central power in Kiev and the the eastern part of Ukraine. And Ukraine made a lot of mistakes in the past because Kiev ignored this eastern part, perhaps not developed much this part. So now it's okay that the Russian expect cultural link over the border, and on the other side, administrative and political federalism in Ukraine. This is my reproach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for those creative ideas. I think you're really like tapping into some of the root causes of this issue, right? One of the problems was there were questions as to whether Ukrainians who primarily spoke Russian or really leaned into Russian culture in the East would be able to continue to speak that language and to kind of celebrate their culture. So this is a way to maybe try and address that piece. Yeah, and then there was this other pattern between 2015 to 2022 was the Minsk agreements that they had made in 2015, and part of that was Ukrainian government was to dialogue with the leaders of the East to figure out some form of political autonomy. right? So they would still be part of Ukraine, but there would be some level of political autonomy, whatever they might come to an agreement about. And that ultimately didn't really happen. Instead, there was really a focus or a leaning into what was called an armed counterterrorism approach, and towards the eastern part of Ukraine, and that kept the violence and hostility relatively consistent until we got to where we are today. So, yeah, both sides were causing problems with those Minsk agreements, but I think some of your ideas, they start to address some of those root causes of kind of where we're at.
Thank you very much indeed for that response. Can we go to Batty Jane, please? Batty, the floor is yours.
Thank you, George. And thank you so much, Ali, for the wonderful talk. Wonderful and insightful, in fact. It was great to listen to you. And just adding to that, I would like to say that when we talk about sustainable peace, then I think everybody will accept that anything can be sustainable if it comes from within. So when peace comes from within, it will be sustainable. So we need to work upon the root cause of violence. We need to find out the root cause of violence, whether the violence is at home or in your region or in any country or between the countries. So if we find out the root cause, and if we work on the root cause of the violence, then definitely we can bring the sustainable peace. So I would like to invite all of you on my talk on 8th March on the same platform, where we will talk on the root causes of violence and the strategies that we are using in my organization or with my research program to overcome that causes, so that we can have a sustainable future. So right now we are working upon youth and women, because I just feel if we nurture these two sectors of the society, then definitely we can have a sustainable and peaceful world. So thank you very much. It was my pleasure to listen to all of you, and Ellie and George, and welcome to all of you on 8th of March. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Batty Jane. We are looking forward to your talk next week, next Wednesday, the same time at Global Peace. And now, Thomas, please, you have a question or comment. You are welcome.
Hello, yes. I did have a supplementary question I didn't share before. I think I'm very frustrated at the logjam in the church's activities for peacemaking. I want to extend the concept of the Catholic Church to its real meaning, a universal church. I want to embrace and include the Orthodox Church, the Anglican Church, the Protestant churches. We are collectively the universal church. And I want to ask Professor McCarthy, if you've been in touch with any Orthodox theologians within either the Russian or Ukrainian Orthodox community, have they got a similar set of teachings? Do they have a sort of just peace tradition? And if not, why not? And can't we reach out to them, like through various channels? I'm in touch with the Anglican equivalent. We have within the Anglican Church a sort of just peace tradition. I think we ought to make an ecumenical move. You should draw on all your Catholic networks and so on, Pax Christian, whatever. And we should reach out to our Russian colleagues and say, hey guys, let's talk just peace here. Let's talk, what is it that you guys want? You want to bomb every single Ukrainian town and reduce it to rubble? Is that your idea of justice? I don't think so. We need to seize the rhetoric space from the warmongers and put it in the hands of the peacemakers like you. And I just wondered if you've reached out, if you know of any Catholic moves. I know that the Pope spoke to the Patriarch of Moscow, but that was really a dialogue of the deaf, as far as I could tell. I don't think he has done his homework on just peace. But anyway, any comments you've got on that would be appreciated.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. That's an amazing idea. I think you're definitely right on. Yeah, there are these trajectories of just peace in the World Council of Churches. I know I've seen a couple documents from Anglican leaders, Methodist Church, and some interfaith expressions as well. So in terms of the Russian Orthodox, so there's an organization called the Orthodox Peace Fellowship, which is part of the larger Fellowship of Reconciliation, kind of international collective. They're based in New York, but they've been helping to support Russian Orthodox deacons and priests in Russia who have either been speaking out against the war or have been trying to get out of the country. So that might be a place to start. And I know, I think it's kind of associated with Fordham University, and Fordham has their own kind of like Orthodox theology group where there's a website and they're, sort of exploring some of this. I've talked to Jesuits in Moscow about some of these things. I haven't communicated with any Russian Orthodox in Russia. I do have some Orthodox contacts in Ukraine, and have been reaching out to some local Russian Orthodox in DC to kind of see if they might be interested in some encounters with local Ukrainians as a way to kind of model restorative circles. But yeah, I think that's a great idea, and would definitely love to explore that with you more practically if you or others would like to.
Okay, thank you. I'll be in touch.
Great.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor McCarthy, for the wonderful presentation. Thank you all for your excellent questions. I can see one from Afiz. I hope it's a quick one. We have 1 minute to go. Afiz, yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. I just observed that we haven't seen some of our members like Janet and others that used to be on board. So I just want to if you can get in touch with them so that they can be with us together as usual. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. They will be joining us, since we've been on a long vacation. I hope they will be joining us soon. So thank you very much indeed, everyone, for coming and for your participation. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone. Wonderful to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.